The room fell silent the moment I walked in. My father chuckled under his breath. My mother shook her head like I'd just embarrassed the whole family again. The judge froze, staring at the uniform I hadn't worn in years. His hand trembled as he whispered, "My God, is that really her?" Everyone turned and stared. Nobody said a word. That was the first time in my life my parents ever went quiet because of me. 2 days earlier, I'd been trimming the overgrown azaleas in my front yard when the envelope came. A cream-colored paper with a county seal I recognized from childhood Portsmouth Family Court, Virginia. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. Case No. 4238B Carter v. Carter. Petition for property division. At first I thought it was a mistake. Then I saw the names plaintiffs Robert and Margaret Carter, defendant Evelyn Carter. My parents were suing me. The words blurred for a second before I laughed out loud, the kind of dry, tired laugh that comes from someone who's seen too many absurd things to cry about one more. I carried the letter inside, set it on the kitchen table, and stared at it while my dog, a big old shepherd named Knox, limped over and rested his head on my knee. "Guess they finally found another way to talk to me," I murmured. It had been 12 years since I left home. The last time I saw my parents, I was wearing fatigues, not dress blues. I'd just finished BUDS, the toughest training in the Navy SEAL pipeline. Dad hadn't even come to the graduation. Mom sent a text that said, "We raised a daughter, not a soldier." So I stopped expecting them to understand. For years I served quietly, logistics planning emergency extractions. I wasn't the hero people wrote about, but I kept ships moving and men alive. I carried that pride silently. Then an IED blast near Al Hudaydah tore through our convoy. I came home with a rebuilt knee, a limp, and a pension check that made civilian life both possible and painfully slow. I bought a small house near Norfolk, fixed it up myself, and tried to forget that my parents never once called. That night, after reading the summons again, I made a pot of coffee and sat down with my old Navy chest, the one that still smelled faintly of sea salt and gun oil. Inside the uniform rested like something sacred, dark blue wool, polished buttons, silver insignia. Next to it, the folded flag they gave me after my best friend, Chief Petty Officer Lewis, didn't make it back. I hadn't worn the uniform since his funeral. Maybe that's why my hands trembled when I lifted it out. Knox tilted his head as I held the jacket up to the light. "Guess they'll see who I really became," I said softly. The next morning I called the courthouse. "Yes, ma'am," the clerk confirmed. "Your parents are petitioning to have the family property transferred to them on grounds of abandonment." I bit down a sharp laugh. Abandonment I was serving overseas. "Ma'am, you'll need to appear in person if you wish to contest it." I thanked her and hung up. Abandonment. The word dug deep. That was what my father had called me the night I enlisted. "You're abandoning your family," he'd said, red-faced and furious grease stains on his mechanic's hands. "No, Dad," I'd replied. "I'm just trying to serve something bigger than myself." He never forgave me for that. I drove by the farmhouse that afternoon, or what was left of it. The paint was peeling, the porch sagging, and the once proud oak tree out front stood half dead. That house had belonged to my grandfather, a Wubwi-Wutu Navy man, who'd built it with his own hands when he came back from Okinawa. He used to tell me, "Every board's got a story, Evie. If you take care of the wood, it'll take care of you." He'd left it to me in his will. Now my parents wanted it. I didn't feel anger, not at first, just disbelief. Like the people who raised me had decided to erase the one good thing connecting us. That night, while the crickets chirped outside and Knox snored on the couch, I opened an old envelope I'd kept for years, a letter from my commanding officer after I was discharged. Commander Carter, "You've served with quiet distinction. Remember, honor doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes it's just the courage to show up." I stared at those words for a long time. Then I went to the closet, pulled out the uniform again, and brushed off the dust. The metals gleamed faintly in the lamplight, silver bronze blue. I pinned each one carefully, like old memories being put back in order. The next morning I looked at myself in the mirror. The jacket fit tighter than I remembered, but it still carried that same weight of pride and purpose. I stood straighter than I had in years. For a moment I thought of not wearing it, but then I imagined walking into that courtroom in plain clothes, letting them believe the story they'd told everyone, that I'd failed, that I'd come home broken. No, not this time. I ran a hand through my hair, adjusted the collar, and whispered to my reflection, "Let's end this quietly." Knox barked as I grabbed my keys. The morning sun had just broken over the horizon, sharp gold, unwavering. And for the first time in years, I felt ready to face my family. By the time I reached Portsmouth, the late summer air was thick with humidity and the smell of salt. The drive from Norfolk had taken less than an hour, but my stomach felt like I'd been on a 12-hour deployment flight. I pulled into the courthouse parking lot early, the engine ticking as it cooled. From the window, I could see the old diner where Dad used to take us on Sunday's bacon black coffee, and his loud voice bragging about my brother Ryan's football trophies. He never once mentioned my grades, my Navy scholarship, or the medals I earned later. The courthouse looked smaller than I remembered. Its bricks faded the flag at half-staff. A janitor was sweeping the steps when I walked up. He nodded politely, his eyes catching the ribbons on my chest. "Ma'am," he said softly, like he wasn't sure if he should salute or not. I smiled. "Morning." Inside, the hall smelled of floor wax and old paper. Families whispered in benches, lawyers shuffled through files. I sat near the back, feeling the stares not judgmental, just curious. A woman in uniform always draws eyes in small towns like this. When the clerk called out Case 4238B Carter versus Carter, I took a deep breath and stood. My knees still ached when I walked, but the rhythm of my steps was steady. Years of drills never leave you. Seeing my parents again hit harder than I expected. Dad had aged, but not softened. His once black hair was gray, but his glare was the same. He wore his Sunday suit, the one that always looked a size too tight. Mom sat beside him, pearls around her neck, posture, perfect eyes full of the same quiet disappointment I grew up with. She whispered something to him when I walked in. I caught only one word: uniform. They looked away before I could speak. I took my seat across from them. Our lawyer table was empty. I didn't hire anyone. I didn't need to. The judge, an older man with a mustache and kind eyes, entered. His nameplate read, Judge Harold L. Simmons. He glanced at me, paused, then cleared his throat. I saw a flicker of recognition before he started the proceedings. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," he said, "you're claiming your daughter abandoned her rights to the property." Dad straightened. "Yes, sir. That house has been sitting empty for years. We've paid the upkeep, the insurance, everything." That was a lie. I'd been paying the property tax through automatic transfer since 2013. The judge turned to me. "Commander Carter, do you have a statement?" Dad blinked. "Commander." The word seemed to hang in the air, heavy as the silence that followed. Mom's lips parted, confusion flickering across her face. "Yes, Your Honor," I said evenly. "I have a few documents." I opened the folder I'd brought: receipts, tax statements, repair invoices, my handwriting, my signature. "I've maintained the property for over a decade," I said. "My parents haven't spent a dime on it since my grandfather passed." Dad leaned forward, face reddening. "You think you can throw that uniform around and make us look bad?" Robert, the judge, warned. Mom reached over, whispering, "Stop it." But he didn't stop. He pointed at me. "You left this family, Evelyn. You went off to play soldier while your mother and I kept everything together." I didn't react. I'd heard those words before, when I joined, when I re-enlisted, when I refused to come home after my brother's wedding. "Sir," I said quietly, "I joined the Navy to serve this country. Not to abandon you, but you made it clear I wasn't welcome in your home." The judge shifted in his seat. "Let's keep this civil." As the hearing went on, I barely heard their accusations: ungrateful, cold, disrespectful. I'd learned in the service how to tune out noise. What struck me wasn't their anger. It was how small it all sounded now. I'd seen men lose limbs and still smile because they believed in something bigger than themselves. And here were my parents fighting over a house that hadn't felt like home in 20 years. Then something unexpected happened. The judge asked, "Commander, forgive me, are you the same Evelyn Carter recognized by the Secretary of Defense back in 2019? The one who led the Yemen evacuation?" Dad frowned. "What evacuation?" I nodded once. "Yes, sir." The judge's voice softened. "I remember that ceremony." He leaned forward slightly. It was one of the proudest days this state had seen. The courtroom went quiet. Even my father couldn't speak. Mom stared at me, her mouth barely open. When it ended, the judge didn't make a ruling right away. He said he'd review the evidence and issue a written decision. But I could tell the tide had already turned. As I walked out, Dad muttered something I didn't catch. Mom didn't move at all. People in the hallway gave me polite nods, small smiles the kind strangers give someone they suddenly respect but don't quite understand. I stepped outside into the blinding sunlight and inhaled deeply. The air smelled like diesel in summer rain. For a second I thought about calling someone, maybe Ryan, my brother, but he'd taken Dad's side years ago. He'd always said, "You think you're better than us because of that uniform." Maybe I did, or maybe I just learned not to bow to the wrong kind of pride. That night I stopped at a roadside diner on my way back to Norfolk. The waitress poured my coffee and said, "You look like you've had a long day." I smiled faintly. You could say that. She looked at the uniform and said, "Thank you for your service." It still felt strange hearing that. I never knew what to say, so I just nodded. When I got home, Knox barked once, wagging his tail, his limp matching mine. I sat on the porch, took off the uniform jacket and laid it beside me. The stars were faint behind the city lights, but I could still pick out the North Star, the same one my grandfather used to point at when I was a kid. When you lose your way, Evie, look for something steady, the sea, the sky, or your own heart. That night I realized I hadn't lost my way. I'd just finally stopped walking back to where I didn't belong. When I pulled into the courthouse parking lot the next morning, I already knew they'd be waiting. Through the glass doors, I saw my father's broad shoulders, stiff and proud, his jaw set like he was about to fight a war he'd already lost. My mother sat next to him, perfectly still, her purse clutched so tightly her knuckles turned white. I didn't look away. I'd spent too many years facing men tougher than him to flinch now. Still, my palms itched, not with fear, with the ache of something that never quite healed the wish that my parents might just once see me for who I really was. The courtroom was smaller than I remembered. Maybe it always was. The wooden benches creaked as people settled, whispers darting like small birds from one end to the other. The air smelled faintly of polish and stale coffee. The bailiff nodded when he saw me enter in my uniform. "Commander," he said quietly, eyes soft with recognition. It caught me off guard. I wasn't used to anyone saying that outside of base. I took a seat at the defense table, my posture straight out of habit. When I placed my hat down, it made a small, solid sound, that sound that comes when metal touches wood. Final. Unapologetic. The clerk called the case, Carter versus Carter. Dad cleared his throat loud enough for half the room to hear. "Well, this is going to be interesting," he muttered. The judge entered, same one as yesterday, Judge Simmons. His robe looked heavy in the heat, and his eyes carried that look of a man who'd seen too many family fights to still believe in winners. He looked at me longer than the others, then said softly, "Commander Carter, good morning." The title caught my parents like a slap. Dad shifted in his seat. "Commander," he repeated, half sneer, half question. I didn't answer. I just nodded to the judge. He opened a folder. "We're here to settle ownership of the Carter property, 47 acres on Maple Creek Road." Dad's lawyer, a local man with a shiny tie, stood up. "Your Honor, my clients maintain that Miss Carter abandoned." "Commander," the judge corrected automatically. The lawyer blinked. "Yes, of course. Commander Carter." He swallowed. "That she abandoned the property over 10 years ago, leaving full maintenance and expenses to her parents." The judge turned to me. "Your response, ma'am." I opened the same folder I'd shown yesterday, this time with more than receipts. I'd printed records from the county assessor's office, tax payments under my name, and a copy of my grandfather's will. "My grandfather left that land to me," I said evenly. "And for 12 years I've paid the taxes on it, every single year, quietly." The lawyer leaned forward. "And what proof do you have that—" I slid the documents across the table. Each transfer was made from my Navy account, direct deposit from active duty pay, and later from my disability pension. The judge read for a moment, brow furrowing. "Everything checks out." He looked to my parents. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter, were you aware your daughter was paying the taxes?" My mother's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Dad answered instead, voice sharp. "If she was, she never said a word." I looked at him. "You never asked." The words landed harder than I meant them to. For a long moment nobody spoke. Then Judge Simmons took off his glasses and sighed. I don't usually say this during proceedings, but I remember you now, Commander. You were part of the rescue operation in 2019, the one off Yemen. Yes, sir. He nodded slowly. That was remarkable work. Dad blinked, confused. What rescue? The judge turned toward him. Your daughter led a joint Navy and civilian team that evacuated 43 Americans trapped in a flood zone. She received the Silver Star for it. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Dad's face went pale. Mom's hand slipped from his arm. I didn't look at them. I just kept my eyes on the judge. He leaned back in his chair, voice calm, but waited. This court finds no evidence that Commander Carter abandoned her property or failed her obligations. In fact, the documentation proves the opposite. He tapped the folder once, then said, "Petition denied." The sound of his gavel hitting wood echoed like a door slamming shut on 20 years of silence. Dad stood abruptly. You can't just... The bailiff took a step forward. Sir. Dad stopped. His shoulders slumped slightly, the first time I'd ever seen that man look smaller than me. Mom stared straight ahead, lips pressed together. I gathered my papers calmly, even though my hands shook a little. It wasn't pride or revenge making them tremble, it was release. The kind that comes when you've carried something too heavy for too long and finally set it down. As I turned to leave, the judge spoke quietly, almost to himself. My God, he said again. Is that really her? He wasn't talking to the clerk or the gallery. He was talking to the father who'd never shown up for graduation, to the mother who'd looked past me, and maybe, just maybe, to the part of me that had stopped believing any of them ever could. Outside, the midday sun hit my face, warm and unforgiving. A couple of locals nodded politely as I passed. One old man in a veteran's cap saluted. I returned it. In the car, I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Knox was waiting for me at home. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a home to go back to, not a house, not land, but a life that was mine alone. I looked in the rearview mirror before driving off. Through the courthouse glass, I saw my parents still sitting there motionless. Maybe they were remembering, or maybe for the first time they were really seeing me. That night I didn't drive home right away. Instead, I stopped at the small harbor near the old naval yard, the same dock where my first deployment began. The tide was low, the boats moored tight ropes creaking softly in the wind. It smelled like diesel salt and ghosts. I sat there in my uniform for a long time, the streetlight flickering above me. Somewhere behind those clouds I could almost see the faces of the ones who never made it back, Chief Louis Ortiz Harper. Men who'd called me Iron Eve, half teasing, half proud. I wasn't thinking about victory. I was thinking about everything I'd lost to earn that silence in court today. People always think being in the SEALs means you're made of steel, but they don't see what it costs. They don't see the nights you wake up drenched in sweat because you heard a sound that wasn't there. They don't see the letters you never send, the ones that start with Dear Mom and Dad and end with a dozen crumpled drafts because you know they'll never write back. During my second deployment, I remember opening a care package from an unknown sender. It had cookies, a small American flag, and a note that just said, "Come home safe." I thought it might have been from my parents. Turned out it was from the base chaplain's wife. That's when I stopped hoping for mail. When I finally came home for good, I didn't tell anyone. No parades, no calls, just me, a duffel bag, and a bad knee that screamed every time it rained. I rented a one-bedroom near Norfolk and tried to live like a civilian. I fixed things, that's what I knew how to do. Small engines, boats, radios. Neighbors thought I was just another quiet veteran who liked his space. I was fine with that. Until one day my bank flagged a payment error for a property tax account. That's when I remembered the farmhouse. The system had stopped accepting the Navy transfer after I left active duty. So I paid it manually, every year, never told anyone. Because it wasn't about the house, it was about my grandfather. He'd been the only one who believed in me. He used to sit on that porch carving wood in the evenings, his uniform cap still hanging by the door from 1946. He'd say, "You've got the same eyes your grandmother had, steady eyes. They don't flinch when life gets rough." When I enlisted, he was the one who drove me to the station. Mom wouldn't come. Dad said it was a waste of talent. But Grandpa hugged me tight before I boarded that bus. "You come back whole," he whispered, "even if you come back changed." He died 2 years later. I was halfway around the world. They buried him without me. When I found out he'd left the house to me, I cried for the first time in years. Not because I wanted it, I didn't. But because in a family that never saw me, he still did. That farmhouse wasn't just a building. It was proof that someone once believed in who I was becoming. So when I heard my parents wanted to sell it, I didn't see property, I saw betrayal. Selling that land would have erased the only part of our family that still had honor left. The night after court, I drove there again. The place looked worse up close, shutters hanging loose, the swing-gone vines crawling up the siding. I walked around the porch with a flashlight, tracing the worn boards with my hand. Under one of them, carved faintly into the wood, were the initials EC, my grandfather's and mine. I smiled. He'd always said names fade, but values stay. I sat on the step staring out at the field where I used to chase fireflies. I could almost hear him humming an old Navy tune, the one about coming home. That's when I realized something. I hadn't come back for revenge. I'd come back to protect what still mattered. The next morning I drove to the courthouse again, not for another hearing, but to deliver one last file. I gave it to the clerk, a quiet woman who'd smiled at me during the trial. "What's this?" she asked. "Proof," I said, "that the house taxes are current, and a note for the record I don't plan to sell it." She nodded slowly. "You're keeping it?" "Yes, but not for me." She tilted her head. "Then for who?" I paused. "For whoever remembers why it was built." That afternoon, as I walked out of the courthouse, I saw my father in the parking lot. He was standing by his truck, smoking, staring at nothing. When he saw me, his mouth tightened. "Congratulations," he said dryly. "You embarrassed us good in there." I took a breath. "Dad, I didn't come to embarrass you. I came because it was right." He scoffed. "Right. You think marching in here in that getup makes you right?" I met his eyes. "No, but it reminds me who I am when you forget." He didn't answer. He just looked away, flicked his cigarette into the gravel, and muttered, "Still stubborn." I turned to leave, but then I heard his voice again, softer this time. "You're like him, you know. Your grandfather. Too proud for your own good." For a second I almost smiled. I'll take that as a compliment. When I got home that night, Knox limped over and pressed against my leg. I sank onto the couch, the exhaustion finally catching up. The house was quiet, but not empty. The kind of quiet that feels earned. I looked down at the uniform folded neatly beside me. It wasn't a symbol of revenge anymore. It was a reminder of who I'd fought to become, and who I refused to stop being. The morning after the hearing, the sun cut sharp through my kitchen blinds, lighting up the dust floating above the table. My uniform still hung over a chair where I'd left it the night before, creases, sharp metals glinting faintly in the light. For the first time in a long time, I didn't know what to do next. I poured myself some black coffee and watched Knox limp toward his food bowl. The sound of his paws on the floor was steady, comforting. I'd trained myself to live by schedule's missions orders. Now there was just silence. Around 9, I got a call from the courthouse. The clerk's voice was polite but nervous. "Commander Carter, Judge Simmons asked me to let you know that the written ruling has been filed. The property remains under your ownership." "Thank you," I said, "and thank him for his fairness." She hesitated before hanging up. "Ma'am, my father served in the Navy. He used to talk about women like you, said you were tougher than most men he ever met." I smiled softly. "Your father sounds like a smart man." When I hung up, I sat for a moment in that quiet kitchen and let it sink in. I'd won, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like the aftermath of a storm, everything still standing but rearranged. By noon, I drove back to town to pick up supplies, paint, sandpaper, a few planks of wood for the farmhouse. On the way out of the hardware store, I saw my father leaning against his truck. He didn't wave, he didn't move, just waited. "Guess we both had business in town," I said, keeping my voice calm. He exhaled smoke from a half-burned cigarette. "You made quite a show yesterday." "It wasn't a show," I said. He looked at me, squinting against the light. "You didn't have to wear that uniform." "I didn't wear it for you." The wind caught the brim of his hat, and for a second his expression softened like he wanted to say something else. But the wall went back up. "You embarrassed your mother," he said finally. I shrugged. "I think she embarrassed herself." He stared at me for a long time, then flicked the cigarette into the dust. "I don't know who you are anymore," he muttered. "That's okay," I said, "I do." That evening, as I worked on repairing a broken fence behind the farmhouse, A pickup pulled up to the edge of the property. The headlights stayed on for a while before the engine cut off. Mom stepped out. She was still in her pearls, but her eyes looked tired, older. She held a small photo frame in her hand. "I found this in your grandfather's drawer," she said quietly, walking up the path. It was a faded black and white picture of him in his navy blues, grinning one arm around a little girl in pigtails. Me. I took it from her slowly. He always said I had his eyes. She nodded. "He was proud of you, even when the rest of us didn't understand." "Why didn't you?" I asked, not accusing, just curious. She looked down at her shoes. "Your father thought the military would change you, make you hard." "It did," I said, "but it also made me strong enough to forgive you." Her eyes lifted, then wet, trembling, unsure. We sat on the porch as the sky turned from gold to violet. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, "He won't admit it, but your father watched that news clip about the rescue. Twice." I smiled faintly. "That's twice more than I thought." She reached out, brushing a bit of lint off my sleeve like she used to when I was little. "He doesn't know how to talk to you, Evelyn. He only knows how to argue." "Yeah," I said softly, "I noticed." Before she left, she turned back at the door. "You should come by Sunday. Dinner's at 6. Your father might actually be home." It was the closest thing to an olive branch I'd ever been offered. "I'll think about it," I said. After she drove away, I walked around the house, touching the walls, the beams, the door frames. Every nail my grandfather had driven felt like part of him still lived there. When I stopped by the front porch, I noticed something carved faintly under the rail, strength without anger. It wasn't my handwriting. It had to be his. And it hit me then maybe the real revenge wasn't the silence in that courtroom or the shock on my parents' faces. Maybe it was standing there now, calm and unbroken, still choosing decency after everything. I spent the next few days restoring the house. Painted the porch, cleared the weeds, repaired the swing. I didn't call anyone for help. I didn't need to. Every nail I drove into the wood felt like forgiveness made tangible. At night, when I'd finished, I'd sit on the steps with Knox beside me and watch the fireflies. The world was still full of noise, news, anger, division, but out here it was just crickets, water, and wind through the cornfields. It was quiet, the kind of quiet you earn. On Friday, as I was cleaning up, I saw a truck pull into the drive again. This time it was Dad. He didn't get out right away, just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, engine running. Finally, he stepped out, walked halfway up the path, and stopped. "You fixed the swing," he said. "Yeah," I said. "Grandpa would have wanted it done right." He looked around the property, the field, the barn, the fresh paint. Then he nodded once. "You did good," he said. No smile, no hug, just that. It was more than I'd ever gotten before. He turned to leave, but then paused. "See you Sunday?" "Maybe," I said. He gave a small grunt. "Don't be late." As he drove away, I sat down on the swing, the boards creaking beneath me, and for the first time since I was a child, I felt like home didn't hurt anymore. Sunday came sooner than I expected. The morning was gray with a thin drizzle misting the windows. Knox followed me from room to room, his nails clicking on the floorboards, as if to ask whether I really intended to go. I looked at my uniform hanging on the back of the chair. Not the full dress blues this time, just the khaki service uniform, neat and clean, simple. It wasn't about making a statement anymore. I just wanted to walk in as myself. The drive out to my parents' place was quiet. Country radio played soft in the background, a song about time and forgiveness. The fields on either side of the highway had turned that pale autumn gold. It had been 12 years since I'd been to that house for dinner. 12 years of missed birthdays, unanswered letters, and news I heard secondhand. When I pulled into their driveway, the old barn was still there, though its red paint had faded to brown. Dad's tools hung in neat rows inside like soldiers waiting for orders. I parked beside his truck and took a long breath before knocking on the door. Mom opened it, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You came," she said, her voice softer than I remembered. "Dinner's at 6, I replied, glancing at my watch. Didn't want to be late. She smiled faintly. "Your father's out back. Go on in." The smell of roast chicken and baked corn filled the house. It was almost enough to make me forget how tense that kitchen used to be. I walked to the back porch and saw Dad sitting on the steps, oiling an old Winchester rifle. It wasn't loaded, just one of the many things he maintained meticulously, as if order could replace peace. He didn't look up when I approached. Thought you wouldn't show. I almost didn't, I said honestly. He nodded, still rubbing the cloth along the barrel. Your mother said you might. We sat in silence for a while. Rain tapped lightly on the tin roof, steady and slow. Then he said, without looking at me, You kept the house. I did. Gonna live there. Maybe fix it first. Grandpa built it right. It just needs care. He nodded again, the cloth pausing mid-stroke. He'd be glad you're taking care of it. I think so, I said. He always believed in finishing what you start. Dad set the rifle aside and looked straight at me for the first time. You think I was wrong, he said. I took a breath. I think you were scared. You wanted a daughter who stayed close. You got one who went far. His jaw tightened. You nearly got yourself killed. I know, but I also helped people live. He leaned back, the weight of years settling into his shoulders. Guess I didn't see it that way. You didn't want to, I said quietly. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The rain stopped. The air smelled like wet earth and sawdust. Finally, he sighed. You know, when that judge said your name, Commander Carter, I didn't even recognize it. Didn't recognize you. I nodded. I barely recognized you either. He let out a dry chuckle. Fair. We went inside. Mom had set the table the same way she used to mashed potatoes on the left, gravy in the blue bowl that had a chip in it since 1995. She poured iced tea, then sat down beside Dad. For a moment it almost felt normal. They asked questions not about medals or missions, but about life. How's your leg still aches when it rains? You living alone out there, just me and Knox. When I mentioned the dog, Mom smiled. You always did take in the broken ones. I smiled back. Guess I became one. Dad looked down at his plate. You're not broken, he said, his voice low. You're just different now. Maybe, I said, but I'm still yours. He swallowed hard, eyes wet. Didn't think you'd ever say that again? After dinner, we stood out on the porch, looking toward the horizon where lightning flickered far away. Dad said quietly, You remember that night before you left for boot camp, I told you not to go. I remember. I was wrong. The words were so simple, but they hit harder than any apology could. He reached into his pocket and handed me something small and worn, Grandpa's old pocket compass. He left this to me, Dad said, but I think it belongs to you now. I opened it. The needle still moved, steady and sure. Inside the lid, faintly etched, were the words, Honor is the only direction that never changes. I blinked fast to keep my voice steady. Thank you, Dad. He nodded once, then put his hand on my shoulder, firm, awkward, real. When I left that night, the porch light stayed on behind me. Halfway down the drive, I looked back through the rearview mirror. They were both standing at the door side by side. No waves, no words, but for the first time I didn't need either. Back home, I placed the compass on my nightstand beside the folded uniform. It caught the light from the window and reflected a soft golden glow across the room. Knox settled at my feet. The world outside was quiet again, different but right. Sometimes reconciliation doesn't come with grand speeches or tears. Sometimes it's just a porch light left on. That night I fell asleep knowing the war between us was over. A few months later, the air had turned crisp again, Virginia autumn sharp and clear with leaves that crackled under every step. The farmhouse was nearly restored now. The porch had new paint. The swing creaked gently in the breeze, and the flag Grandpa left me fluttered proudly above the door. I'd replaced the old window glass, cleared the yard, fixed the roof. Every board I repaired felt like stitching something larger back together, not just the house, but a story, a family. Knox stayed close, limping beside me as I worked his fur silvering at the muzzle. Almost done, buddy, I told him. Almost. When the sun set behind the trees, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the world turn gold. For the first time, the house didn't look lonely. It looked lived in again. A few cars pulled into the driveway that evening. My parents stepped out first, then my brother Ryan and his wife holding a casserole dish like a peace offering. I stood to greet them, wasn't expecting a crowd. Dad shrugged. Your mother said we should see the place before you finish it. Figured she was right. Mom smiled, eyes soft. Smells like paint and coffee, your grandfather would have loved that. Ryan looked around awkwardly, shoving his hands in his pockets. You did all this yourself? Mostly, I said. Took a while. He nodded slowly. Looks good, real good. For a family that used to speak in criticism, that small sentence was thunder. We ate dinner on the porch, simple food laughter that came in small waves, hesitant but genuine. At one point, Dad lifted his glass of sweet tea and said, "To the Carters and to the one who finally made us proud." I froze for a second, unsure if I'd heard right. Then I raised my glass, "To the ones who taught me what pride really costs." Mom's eyes glistened, but she smiled. It wasn't perfect, it didn't have to be. After they left, I stayed outside watching the taillights disappear down the dirt road. The porch light glowed steady above me, their light this time not mine. I thought about all those years of silence, of trying to prove myself, of mistaking pride for peace. All that time I thought justice was about being right. Now I understood it was about being honest and gentle when you finally could be. The next morning I drove into town to visit the local high school. They'd invited me to speak for Veterans Week. The principal, a kind woman with gray hair and bright eyes, introduced me to the students. "This," she said, "is Commander Evelyn Carter, Navy SEAL, and one of our own." The gym went quiet. Teenagers who usually fidgeted in their seats sat straight, curious. I stepped up to the microphone, feeling the same calm I'd felt that day in court. "I used to think honor was about medals," I began. "Then I learned it's about choices, the ones you make when no one's watching." I told them about Grandpa, about the farmhouse, about forgiveness. I didn't mention the courtroom or the pain that came before it. They didn't need to hear that part. They needed to hear that strength isn't the same as anger, and that silence can be its own kind of victory. When I finished, the students stood, not out of protocol, out of respect. That night, I drove back to the farmhouse. The sky was a dome of stars, cold and wide. I walked to the porch, sat down, and took Grandpa's compass from my pocket. The needle still pointed steady north. On the back of the lid under his old engraving, I'd added a line of my own: "Forgiveness is the truest form of discipline." Knox rested his head on my lap, sighing. The flag rippled softly in the breeze. I thought about that day in the courtroom, my father's chuckle, my mother's disbelief, the judge's whisper. If I could go back, I wouldn't change a thing. They needed to see the uniform not as revenge but as truth, the visible proof of everything they'd never known about me. And I needed to remember that dignity isn't what you wear, it's what you keep when life tests you. As the porch light flickered gently against the night, I whispered, "Grandpa, I think you can rest now." The wind answered with a soft rustle through the oak leaves. And for the first time in my life, I felt no bitterness, just gratitude for the pain, the distance, the lessons that shaped me. Because without them, I'd never have found the strength to come home with peace instead of pride. To anyone listening, if you've been misunderstood, if your family turned away, if your silence was mistaken for weakness, don't rush to prove them wrong. Just keep living right. Let time do the talking. And when the day comes to walk back through their door, do it without anger. That's what real honor looks like. If this story reminded you of someone, a parent, a child, a friend you haven't called in years, reach out. Tell them you're still here. And if you believe in second chances, in families that can heal, and in quiet acts of courage, subscribe, share, or simply sit in silence for a moment and remember that forgiveness too can wear a uniform.